Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of Finders Keepers, the podcast where we help you find the best keepers for your keeper and dynasty leagues. I'm your host Jordox, and this podcast is brought to you by the Coaches Panel. It's a very exciting time of the year as we've well and truly started our preparations for the upcoming fantasy season. But best of all, it's ranking season. And everyone's trying to get all their ducks in a row in preparation for the upcoming draft, whether it be a single season draft or what we love on this podcast, Keeper League Draft. To launch ranking season here on Finders Keepers, I've had a look at the defenders most likely to be available in your redrafts. The main criteria being anyone who averaged under 80 in season 24. And I've ranked them based on how I see their value entering season 2025. I've landed on 25 players who I think will add value to your side for a variety of reasons, whether it be as a starting player for your squad who can contribute to your on-field success straight away, or maybe it's a future prospect who is worth stashing now. There's also a separate group of 6 players who averaged under 80, but I haven't included them in the rankings. And this is because I believe they are very unlikely to be available in most leagues. And look, if they are unowned, make them a priority. So I'll go through these 6 players a little bit later on. Now, before I get started on the rankings themselves, it's probably worth giving some structural context to the way I look at things, and probably the premise of this podcast will be based around a 30-man squad where you keep 15 year on year. On field is 18 players with the commonly used formation, 5 defenders, 7 midfielders, 1 ruck and 5 forwards. Now the last thing is you'll notice that I haven't included any of the 2024 draftees. So the reason for that is I think that they probably deserve their own rankings on their own. And I really want these rankings to be about players who 6 months ago were delisted or, not even drafted, unowned, and are now suddenly relevant, whether it be from a role change or change of clubs or whatever it may be. All right, I reckon we can probably get started. So here are my top 25 defender options for your redrafts this year. Coming in at number 1, I've got one of a few big recruits for Collingwood in the off-season, and that's the former Giant Harry Perryman. Now, the reason I've put him in at number 1 is he ticks a lot of boxes. So he's fieldable straight away. You can put him straight into your side. He's at a pretty good age. He's 26, so should just be in his prime given the right role and plenty of years ahead. And I'm really quite bullish on what he can do for Collingwood, and I do see a role for him in their midfield. So his big move at the end of last year, he had the opportunity to go to other clubs and he chose Collingwood. And I don't know for sure, but I reckon there would have been some conversation about him playing some midfield time. And when he's played midfield time in the past, he's been close to a 90 guy. So a few years ago now. He's had a lot of injuries, has been in and out of the side and played so many different roles for the Giants. But I think at Collingwood he could slot into a midfield spot, and I think his scoring could be pretty handy, and that's why I've got him at number 1. He'd be the first pick for me. Number 2 is a guy that you probably won't have on the field just yet, and that's Josh Weddle. He's not going to be attractive to those looking at the averages from last year. He only averaged 59. But what I love about Weddle is every time I've watched him play, there's just something special about him. It's hard to kind of explain it. He's a big lad, 192 centimetres, plays in the back line, can play on the wing. He even kicked 3 goals in a game, so he's probably even of value to them forward. But look, this isn't going to be the year he starts scoring well. He scored a few 90s last year. But I just think for the future, he is a guy that is probably going to be available. There would have been a lot of hype when he was first drafted, and I reckon there'd be some coaches who were frustrated with his output and have dropped him back to the pool. So if he's in your pool, I really like him at number 2. At number 3 is a guy who's part of seemingly a long list of players who could get a bit of a scoring bump with the departure of Dan Houston. So this is Kane Farrell. He actually had a breakout last year playing with Houston. He averaged 78 and he's 25 years old. So this is a guy I definitely have on the field. I'm not necessarily sure his bump will come from Houston's departure due to kick-ins, because he actually took more kick-ins than Houston last year, although Houston did miss the last game. But I do think there's going to be more points back there for Port, and I can see Farrell really building on his breakout of last year and being used a lot more, and could even push that average 85, 90. So I've got him in there. Number 4 is a guy who feels like he's been around a long time, but he hasn't. That's Lockie Ash at the Giants. So he had a pretty good year last year. He averaged 77. But it is getting to a point with Ash where I think if anyone who still owns him or has owned him in the past is probably wondering, is this his ceiling? Is this as good as it's going to get for him? But he's only 23, and I think there is a world where he can improve on his average, certainly this year, but more down the track, maybe when a Lockie Whitfield retires, as an example. So I'd definitely be grabbing him if he's there. Number 5, I've got another Port Adelaide defender who could see a bit of a bump with Houston leaving, and that's Miles Bergman. Now, he's a bit different to Farrell. He's a lot tougher and harder, and plays more around the ground. But he averaged 75 and he's only 23 as well. So he's another guy that I'd be very comfortable putting into my side, maybe as my last defender, and just hoping that, he can build on the 75 he had last year. Number 6 is Mac Andrew from Gold Coast. Now, he's not someone I'd have on the field, certainly not based on his scoring last year. He averaged 64. But similar to Weddle, when I watched Mac Andrew play last year, he just looked like a guy that is going to be not only brilliant for the Suns, but I could really see a fantasy game for him. Now, they did play him forward at points last year. I feel like that was a bit of an experiment, and it worked. He did kick the winning goal after the siren. Sorry, Bombers fans. But I see his future in the back line as a key defender / interceptor, and that's where he'll do the bulk of his scoring. So he should be available. Again, not someone I'd be putting on field with any confidence in 2025, but I think the future's really bright for him, and Gold Coast clearly agreed because they just gave him a huge deal. So he'll be a Sun for life if he stays as long as his contract. Number 7, I've got another young Sun, another young Gold Coast boy, Bodie Hewland. He's another guy whose average doesn't look too flash on paper, 62. But again, there were games last year I saw him really dominate and really read the play well off half-back. Now, Gold Coast have seemingly 100 players who can play off half-back, and even though this will be Dimmer's second season, we're none the wiser on who's going to be that role long term. But I think Hewland put his hand up last year, and he's only 21. I'd love a piece of him in any keeper league, so definitely one for this list. Number 8 is another young defender who, unfortunately, his career has sort of been affected by injuries so far, and that's Heath Chapman at Freo. I think 12 months ago he was pretty popular and on a lot of people's lips in pre-seasons, and then he did an injury just before the start of the season. Now, he did come in and eventually average 66, but I think he'll be available based on that, and a bit similar to the Weddle, coaches might be a little bit frustrated by him so far, that I think he'd be available. And I think he's going to be a really good player for Freo and for fantasy. It's just whether he can get his body right. Number 9, we have yet another Gold Coast half-backer in Will Powell, another guy whose career has been really offset by injuries. So he's 25 now, so he certainly should be getting towards the peak of his powers. He averaged 75 last year, and I think he will I think that's sort of his base average now. I think he's going to be 75 at least for the rest of his career if he's fit. I think they like the ball in his hands. I think they like him in that role, and I can see him pushing 80, 85 as well if his body stays fit. On to number 10, and we have our first veteran on the list. It's the great Jake Lloyd. Yes, he was a absolute fantasy superstar for the last, 6, 7, 8 years or whatever it's been. And, perhaps we're writing him off a little early, but we did see him last year go towards a wing and his scoring dropped right off. But if he's available, and I think some will have delisted, he's 31, so he's not ancient. He's still got years ahead of him. And, he averaged 76, and that's not terrible. And even if he does that, he's going to be a reasonable, maybe your last defender on field. But what I like about Lloyd is the name, and you get someone like that in, all it takes is a few really good scores from him throughout the year, and all of a sudden he becomes like trade bait for the rest of your league. So you could then pitch to other coaches in your league for a trade, say, hey, I've got Jake Lloyd, and he's back. It's the Jake Lloyd. So you never know. He could be a guy that, has reasonable output as your last defender, but if he does do a couple of good scores, you might be able to sell him for more than he's worth. At number 11, it's a pretty similar story. Mitch Duncan for Geelong. He's 33, so a bit older than Lloyd. Average 78, which isn't terrible, but his body has really let him down a lot in the last few years, and I guess across his career, to be fair. But the thing with Duncan is, if he gets that cushy halfback role, he could score anything. So it's worth having him. You could play him on the field even if he's not off halfback, even if he's just on a wing. I think his scoring will be okay. And then similar story to Lloyd again, like if he punches out some really good scores and maybe you're not looking at being a chance in the finals for this season, you could probably trade him to someone else in your league and get some good assets back your way. Number 12, and it's the only player on the list who hasn't actually played an AFL game yet. So Saad El Hawley was picked up by Essendon in the mid-season draft last year. Didn't get a game in the seniors, but he's a mature age recruit at 23 years old, and from all accounts he dominated the VFL, playing a very fantasy-friendly role off half-back. In fact, I think he even averaged 100 in the VFL. So look, it's a tricky one because we don't know at this point if we're going to see him in opening round one for this year. But I think he'll get games, and when he plays, he's going to have a good opportunity. You've got Dyson Heppel's left. Who else they've got back there? Mason Redman had a poor year. He'll probably want it back. And Ridley, hopefully for him, is fit. So I do think there's a role there. It's just going to be a bit interesting to see what the makeup is. But if he gets a game, he's going to score really well. Number 13 is another veteran and, just a solid citizen in the fantasy world, Stephen May for Melbourne. He averaged 76 last year, and that's kind of what he's done for a long time. He's 32, so he's not your future, but you could pull him in and have him as a depth guy for sure. Ideally he's not on your field, but if he's called up to be the last defender, I don't think it's going to be an issue. He dominates the kick-ins for Melbourne. I've always wondered how he ends up having with such a decent fantasy scoring for a key defender, but that's it. He takes a lot of kick-ins, and I don't really see that changing in 2025. So I think he's got at least one more year of being a handy last defender / depth player. Number 14, we have Zach Guthrie from Geelong. Now, don't let that baby face fool you. He's 26 now, Guth, so he's certainly been in the system for a while, and he's always been a favourite of mine. I've had him in teams in the past because I've just sort of waited for that big breakout. And look, it did happen to a point last year. He averaged 75 and was, he broke out for the Cats in terms of their squad. He's a very important part of that back six. So is 75 the best you're going to get from him? I can see him definitely improving on that. And then, down the track when Tom Stewart retires, maybe he becomes the real commanding figure in that back line and gets that average up towards the 90s. Who knows? But he's still young enough and he'd be worth a punt. 15, Ryan Burton, another Port defender who could be the one to inherit all those juicy Dan Houston points. I mean, he's been ravaged by injury, certainly in his Port Adelaide years. He averaged 66 last year. He's 27. He's a really good player when he's fit. So I could see a world where he's got his body right and he could be a real distributor for Port out of the back line, and will definitely improve on that average. At number 16, we've got another Gold Coast halfback type, and that's the newly arrived John Noble, coming across from Collingwood in the off-season. Now, he averaged 74 last year, and he's always been around that mark. A handy defender, ideally just a depth guy for your squad. But I think with him coming across to Richmond, I think there's a purpose and a role for him, and I think Demo will put him, I don't want to say like a Jaden Short role, that's a little bit over the top, but I can see him averaging 80 definitely this year. He's 27, so not a super long play, but definitely fieldable, or at the very worst, depth. Number 17, we've got Josh Battle, another player who found a new home in the off-season, joining Hawthorn from St Kilda. He's really interesting, Battle, because he is a key position defender, but he does have games where he really scores high. But then he has games, where he scores really, really small. So his average always seems to average out. He averaged 74. He's 26. He's come across, as a big recruit for the Hawks. I can see him getting an 80 average, playing a similar role, just with more ball. And he's a really good player. So at a new home, we could see an uptick in points. At number 18, I didn't have this guy in my original list, and I just rejigged it sort of based on training reports. But Wayne Miller at Adelaide is a somewhat forgotten man, and as a Crows fan, it's been really frustrating to see him look so exciting and silky in pre-season, and then inevitably an injury comes and you barely see him. He played a few games last year for an average of 62. He's 27 now, so it really is getting to the point where it's now or never for him. And look, the Crows have brought in a lot of players. There's a lot of talk about Isaac Cumming and maybe even Rory Laird going back to halfback. But I think there's a role for Miller. In fact, I know there's a role for Miller if he's healthy, whether it's distributing off halfback or more of a wing role. He's even been tried forward in previous years. I can't see that really happening now, not with the Crows forward line the way it is. But just don't forget about Miller. Don't sleep on him. If he's fit and playing, he'll score. Number 19 is another guy who isn't going to set the world on fire, but is fine for your depth, maybe your last defender. That's Callum Wilkie at St Kilda. So he's 28, not exactly young. Averaged 74 last year. I think it was the year before he had a really big fantasy year. I do think that was a bit of a one-off, and 74 is probably closer to what he's going to be. But he'll be playing every week, and he's a guaranteed 70-odd points with the opportunity to go a little bigger with the amount of marks he takes. Staying at St Kilda at number 20, I've got Ari Schoenmaker. So this is definitely not a fieldable guy just yet. He's only 20 years old, and he's only played 4 games of footy, and that was last year for an average of 59. But what really strikes me as interesting with Schoenmaker is I can't think of too many times in the history of the game a player has debuted and been given the responsibility of taking kick-ins, and that's what happened with this young fella last year. In fact, he took kick-ins in all 4 games he played. So with Battle leaving and a bit of a rejig, there's a chance he gets games this year, and I think they really believe in him. Drafting him now, if he's there, I think it's worth a go, but just be aware, you may be a year too early and the scores might not be there, but certainly one for the future. And, if you've got room for him, I'd stash him. Similar story with number 21. We've got Lockie Cowan from Carlton. Now, I don't know a great deal about this kid, but I have heard, from people I speak to in the fantasy world and the things I read is there's a chance he could be the main man in that backline for Carlton in the future. He's 20, so yeah, still very young. Averaged 57 last year. And look, this is probably not going to be the year for him, but you just never know. And I don't think it would be terrible to grab him and just pop him away. And then, obviously with the recent injury to Nick Newman, that's going to change things in the Carlton backline. So whether it's Doherty who goes back or it's Ollie Hollands we've heard a bit about, I just wouldn't discount Lockie Cowan maybe performing a year earlier than we had thought. And if he does and you've got him, you'll be very happy because you'll have got him for a bargain. Number 22, we have Max Michelini from the Crows. He's a guy who, look, he's a brilliant footballer. I think he's a future captain of the club, to be honest. He's only 20, but yeah, he plays with such an assurance. He averaged 65 last year. They experimented with him playing a little bit of midfield minutes as sort of like a tagging role. Didn't really help his fantasy scoring exactly, and I don't think we're going to see that again in the future. I think he is where he is. He's a half-back. He's a third tall. He reads the play well, and they like it in his hands. So, look, I wouldn't be surprised if he bumped his average up from 65, maybe even to a 75 this year. That would be quite a jump. But I think that's kind of what he's going to be for the next few years. Very reliable and certainly a best 22 side, best 23 player in the side for the Crows. Number 23, we have a guy who has been around and, he's sort of gone in and out of fantasy obscurity, and that's Ollie Florent for the Swans. Last year, I think, was his best year. He averaged 77. And what I like about Florent as a depth guy, I wouldn't be too comfortable with him on your field. But he has a ceiling. So when the game is right and the role is right, he can score like anyone. He's put up some big ones over the years, but hasn't had that consistency of scoring, consistency in role. But maybe another guy, maybe if Jake Lloyd continues to go down, maybe Florent can go up. But I wouldn't be too excited about getting him in and chucking him on the field. But in terms of depth guys, he's a really good one for that. Number 24, we have another Crow in Luke Nankervis. He's 21, still plying his trade, finding out what he's going to be in the AFL world. Could he be the halfback answer that the Crows have been looking for to replace Brodie Smith, who's not far off retirement? Or is he more suited to a wing, getting up and down the ground? But he's silky smooth, he's great to watch, and he has a fantasy game about him. So I don't know what he's going to be, but he's certainly someone worth taking a punt on. I wouldn't be too confident having him on field, but he could fill in from time to time, and he'll pop some good scores, I think, for sure. And lucky last in the 25, we have Sam De Koning from the Cats. And look, the only reason I've got him here, so he's a key defender for mine. Like, he's pretty good at intercepting and all that, and I think his fantasy scores will be okay throughout his career. But we just saw something last year from Geelong, which was quite unexpected in my opinion, and they threw him into the ruck. He actually rucked against his brother. I don't know if you remember that. That was very entertaining. The two of them were at each other's throats the whole game, which is what you want to see when two brothers play against each other. But he scored really well as a main ruck, as a number one ruck. I believe he scored a ton at some point as well in that role. If I thought he was Geelong's answer, long-awaited answer to the number one ruck spot, I would have had him much higher up on my list. I don't think he will be their ruck. I think he'll be key back who's good at reading the play and will score well enough, but not a superstar. But he's just worth having a nibble on, I reckon, because if something happens and he does turn into a ruckman, you've got yourself a pretty big scorer there, and you've paid, next to nothing for it. But again, I think Toby Conway's the answer for Geelong in the rucks, so we'll wait and see. We'll wait and see how that eventuates. And there you have it. That's my top 25 defenders likely to be available in your redrafts for 2025. And as I sort of said, it covers, all the different targets that a keeper coach might have. It's got your older guys, got your future guys, your depth guys. Yeah, they're all in there. So how you see these rankings and the players that you're after, it'll vary depending on where you're at. You might be in the premiership window and just looking for points on field right now, or you might be towards the bottom, rebuilding, looking to the future. So that's what I love about keeper leagues. It's so different for every coach, but looking at all the players as a whole, that's what I came up with. Now, I also said at the start that there were a group of players, 6 players, who did average under 80 last year, but I didn't include them in the rankings for the simple reason that I'd be very surprised if any of these guys are available in any pools. And certainly if any of them are available, I'd be ranking all of them ahead of the entire 25 that I went through before. So who are those players? Let's have a quick look at them, and then we'll wrap up the first episode of Finders Keepers. So the 6 players that I don't believe will be available, who averaged under 80, are Matt Roberts from Sydney, who had a real breakout, averaged 76, but that was very sub-affected, and I think he's about to set the world on fire in fantasy terms. Darcy Wilmot from Brisbane, similar, had a nice breakout, averaged 75, but I think he's only just getting started. Lawson Humphreys for Geelong, he sort of came out of nowhere, didn't he? Sort of mid to late last year, and watching him play, it was like, this can't be a kid who's just recently debuted. He looks so cool and calm. He only averaged 71, but I'd be staggered if he hadn't been noticed in your leagues and was available. Callum Mills doesn't really need an introduction, does he? An absolute, gun of the competition when he's fit and firing, but only averaged the 70 coming in late last year, but clearly he's going to be a lot better than that. Logan Evans, who is another guy who was taken in the mid-season draft by Port Adelaide, came in and just had an impact straight away. So I think he's a guy that will definitely improve, and another guy who'll get a bump from the Dan Houston departure, but certainly the way he played and how quickly he slotted in, I'd be surprised if he was available. And then the last one is Kadeen Coleman, who just averaged the paltry 34 last year, but he suffered a season-long injury, and he's been missing for 12 months. And I think when people think of him, they don't think of his average last year. They think of his game in the 2023 grand final when he was on 100 at half-time and well on track for a Norm Smith medal. He'll be a slower start this year coming back from injury, but again, I'd be very surprised if anyone had him. So they're the 6 players I'd have ahead of the 25 if by chance they're available. And that brings us to the end of the very first episode of Finders Keepers. I really hope you've enjoyed it, and more importantly, I hope you can use these rankings to help you plan for your upcoming redrafts, because they are just around the corner. Next up, on the next episode, I'll be looking at the midfield. And midfielders are really interesting in keeper leagues, as you would be well aware. So, had a lot of fun going through that list, and I'm looking forward to bringing that list to you next. So keep an eye out for when that episode drops, and in the meantime, good luck for the rest of your pre-season. I'm Jordox, this has been Finders Keepers, and until next time, keep on keeping on.